But then there's another side of it, which is impinged a little bit on the other, is when you ask the question of teachers as to whether they see their role as being a linear process, or there's a linear process or a non-linear process. And we usually wrap that up by sort of asking them whether they see themselves more akin to sort of having a job as an industrialist, producing stuff and doing it in a linear way, so that you know what the end result is and you can cost effectively work out what components are needed, at what time and at what cost going to be put in, and the end result is going to be the product that you envisage, and you can pretty well plan what's going to happen. Or whether you are, and of course I always use sort of emotive words to get the right answer here. That you are a nurturing farmer, sort of lovingly caring for every tender plant that you put in the ground, sort of stuff. The non-linear process, of course, where you know what the end result is supposed to be, but there are lots of factors that are going to get in the way. That means you can't predict it in the same way you can in a linear process. So that's the non-linear process. And of course, most teachers will go for, well, in an ideal world, we would like to work in a non-linear way. That's the reality of the relationship with students and with the language and with all the general environment in which we work. But of course, there's that conflict because the education system, is a linear one that's built on assessment processes and outcomes that can be measured fairly accurately. So there's always this internal conflict between what a teacher might see or might experience within the classroom and the end results that are needed out completely non-linear. So that's another sort of underlying problem. And if you ever want to put where reading, especially reading literature, reading stories, let's call it that, reading stories is, if ever there was a non-linear process, that's it. That whole absorption of whatever you're reading into your own psyche, your own ability, your own history, that the way that it collides and becomes whatever it is. In fact, we all know that we read a story in a totally different way to the person sitting next to us reading exactly the same story. How do you deal with that in a classroom? That's an extreme part of the conflict. But it also ought to be the clue to why we should be doing this. I'm reminded at this point of, I'm sure you've seen I'm sure you're one of the, was it 7.5 million people who've seen the Ken Robinson, you must, yes, you've seen it. Very inspiring, he's sort of,
the TED Talks, is it?
The TED Talks, yeah. The Ken Robinson, he's done two. He did one about 4 years ago, and he did another one.
Killing creativity in education, of course.
Creativity. I mean, he's known as Mr. Creativity, I think, these days. Yeah. And his message is very much that, sorry folks, but we've got the education system wrong. It doesn't work like we think it does. And here's how it is. And if you want to see it actually beautifully summarised, it's done by the RSA. You can Google it with RSA Animates, and there's a wonderful animated version of his talks that have been all put into one sort of 15-minute little thing, using Prezi. Have you come across Prezi? I've just started experimenting with it. It's a great alternative to PowerPoint because it's dynamic. It doesn't have these slides that just keep appearing. It moves all over the place. You have like one giant canvas which you can put things all over, and it'll move and rotate all over the place. And so you get a sense of relationship and perspective. It takes a bit of getting used to, but it looks really good. But this has obviously been done on Prezi. It's a wonderfully, very visual presentation of something which interesting message. Okay, that's just what we're coming down to. Information becomes knowledge. And so what we're aiming for is understanding the fact that there is a personalised conceptual framework that everyone has. The sum total of their experiences is the conceptual framework, and how does the information you're feeding into it fit into that? That's part of the thing. We're taking a particular part of that, and we're just looking at the concept of story or narrative And I would include poetry in narrative. It's a very acute form of narrative, but I think it's there. So how do we fit all to this into the narrative experiences that everyone has, including our students? And I think it's true to say that everyone is the sum total of their stories. You know, put it all together. If you strip away all our stories, what have we got left? We've got, apart from this, we've got nothing to say. And as communicative creatures, that rather puts us on a handicap. But you know, everything from the very real tales of what happened to me on the way here today, to the stories we heard as children, the stories that were real, the stories that were fictional, the stories we've read, the stories that we invented with our friends. These are all part of the narrative framework, and we actually understand stories. There's a guy called, is another professor like Ken Roberts called Kieran Egan. I write his name on the board. No, don't really. Kieran, we can all do Kieran Egan. Kieran and then E-G-A-N. He's a professor of education. He's an Irish guy, works in Canada. If ever you get a chance to see him talk, he's one of these people who talks about the big picture of education. But if he wasn't a top-rate educationist, then he would get a job as a stand-up comic. You know, he's just one of these people who's able to communicate extraordinarily well in but he has this passionate belief that teaching is actually narrative, and that teaching should be narrative. Now he's written a book called Teaching as Storytelling, and he concentrates on primary education. But what he's basically saying is that we misunderstood the way children understand stories. That instinctively young children understand how a story works from the youngest age that they can possess language, they can use it. And that within that concept of narrative, they understand very complex problems. For example, that they understand the idea of polar opposites, and they will understand the idea of gradation. So it's quite abstract concept. There's good and there's evil, and there's varying degrees of this, and that there's resolution that happens within it. These are fairly abstract ideas, but the kids understand that level of abstraction long before they understand far more concrete things, and that we ignore this in education at our peril. And he devised a very interesting theory. I'm sure it's not going to be adopted anytime soon, but the whole idea is, we've got it wrong. Think of narrative and plan all your lesson plans based on the concept of narrative and resolution of conflict within the narrative framework. It's a very interesting theory.